Welcome, friends, to Sci-Fi Travelers. In this episode, I'll tell you the story of Adrian, a human, and Nova, an alien woman. Sit back and enjoy this amazing story. Happy viewing. Everyone else was given an ordinary translator, but I was given the fiercest alien woman in the galaxy. The shuttle came down through Karth's violet cloud layer, the way an apology descends through an awkward silence, slowly, and with everyone aboard hoping it would be over soon. Adrian pressed his forehead to the viewport and watched a city assemble itself out of the haze. Obsidian spires that didn't so much reach for the sky as threaten it. Black glass catching the light of two suns and throwing it back in colors human eyes hadn't been issued vocabulary for. Somewhere below, a treaty was waiting to be argued into existence. Somewhere below, a great many Karthans were waiting to be unimpressed by the species that had come to argue it. Breathtaking, said Ambassador Owen, who had a gift for saying the obvious in a tone that suggested he'd invented it. Absolutely breathtaking. It's the atmosphere, said Adrian. Low oxygen. Technically, we are all a little short of breath. You're welcome to be moved by the architecture too, sir. But let's give the air its share of credit. Owen did not laugh. Owen had not laughed at anything since the pre-departure briefing, where a Xeno protocol officer had spent 90 minutes explaining all the ways a human could accidentally declare war on Karth by using the wrong hand, the wrong tense, or the wrong number of teeth in a smile. Adrian had taken notes. Adrian had also privately concluded that the surest way to avoid declaring war was to say as little as possible and let the professionals handle the rest, which was a fine plan for a junior envoy, right up until the moment it wasn't. They disembarked into a receiving hall the size of a modest weather system. The ceiling vanished upward into shadow. The floor was polished until it doubled the room and made you feel outnumbered by your own reflection. A line of Karthan officials stood waiting, tall and unhurried, their long ears held at angles Adrian was almost certain carried meaning, the way a raised eyebrow does, or a very slowly loaded pause. Beside each official waited a translator. This was the part everyone had been told about. Every human envoy would be assigned a Karthan guide, a linguistic chaperone to steer them through the reefs and shoals of court etiquette, so nobody blundered into an unplanned centuries-long blood feud before lunch. The translators were, to a being, magnificently unremarkable. They were the sort of people the universe manufactures in bulk for the express purpose of standing politely to one side. Soft voices, neutral robes, faces built for the middle distance. One by one they attached themselves to their humans, a gentle murmur here, a courteous half-bow there, and one by one the envoys relaxed, because it is very reassuring to be handed a person whose entire job is to make sure you don't die embarrassingly. Owen got a mild one named something Adrian didn't catch. The trade attaché got a mild one. The protocol officer got a mild one who looked like she'd been specifically bred to diffuse tension by being aggressively forgettable. Down the line it went, human after human, each collecting their quiet, capable shepherd, until the ceremony had the smooth, mechanical rhythm of a thing that was going exactly to plan. Then it was Adrian's turn, and the plan, apparently, had other ideas. The murmuring in the hall did something Adrian felt before he understood. A hush spreading outward, the particular silence of a great many people who have all just decided to watch. A figure stepped forward from the far end of the line, and the reason for the hush became immediately, magnificently clear. She was red. Not a shy, sunset sort of red, but a deep, arterial crimson, the color of a warning label that has stopped bothering to be subtle. She stood a full head taller than Adrian, which Adrian's spine registered as an urgent bulletin. Her ears, long swept back, notched in two places by things Adrian sincerely hoped had been accidents, lay flat against her skull in a way that even a total stranger to Karthan body language could parse as do not. Scars mapped her arms and throat, a cartography of arguments, each one presumably concluded in her favor. And her eyes, when they found Adrian, performed a swift and thorough appraisal that ended, unmistakably, in a verdict. The verdict was disappointing. Somewhere behind Adrian, the trade attaché whispered, "Is that a translator?" And someone whispered back, "I think that's a sentence." The Karthan official beside her spoke a few clipped syllables. The red woman did not translate them so much as let them fall out of her mouth like something she'd found stuck to her boot. "This is Nova," she said, in standard so precise it was practically weaponized. "I am assigned to you. Try to keep up." Adrian became aware that every human eye in the hall had swiveled to him, with the collective sympathy usually reserved for someone about to be read a will, their own. He was also aware, distantly, of the diplomatic reality of the thing. Every other envoy had been given a functionary, and he had been given a legend. This was not a courtesy. Somewhere in the elaborate machinery of Karthan protocol, someone had reached in, selected the single most alarming individual on the planet, and pointed her at the most junior human present like a loaded question. It was an insult. It was possibly a threat. It was arguably both, elegantly gift-wrapped. Adrian considered his options. He could feint, which had the appeal of ending the conversation. He could complain to Owen, who would helpfully call it breathtaking. Or he could do the thing he always did when the ground opened under him, which was to keep talking and hope words were load-bearing. He extended a hand, remembered the 90-minute lecture about hands, and turned it into a small, careful bow instead. "Adrian," he said, "pleasure. Quick question before we start. Do you prefer translator, escort, or the last thing several people ever saw? I want to get the introductions right. I'm told getting them wrong can start a war, and I'd hate to peak on day one." Nova looked at him for a long, geological moment. She did not laugh. Nothing about her suggested she had ever laughed, or would consider it without a signed treaty and witnesses. "Keep up," she said again, and turned and walked, and Adrian, with the distinct sensation of stepping willingly into weather, followed the fiercest woman in the galaxy into the black glass heart of the court. The council chamber was built to make you feel small, and it was very good at its job. It descended in rings, tier upon tier of Karthan dignitaries folded into seats of carved obsidian, the whole thing plunging toward a central floor where the humans had been arranged like specimens at the bottom of a well. Overhead, a lattice of luminous filaments drifted and reformed, and Adrian gathered after some squinting that it wasn't decoration, but a living record. The court's proceedings written directly into light, each word a thread that flared and faded. Say something foolish here, and it would hang glowing above your head for everyone to admire before it dissolved. Adrian resolved once again to say very little. This resolution survived roughly 4 minutes. The talks opened with the ceremonial exchange of grievances, which the protocol officer had assured everyone was a warm and traditional gesture and which sounded, in practice, exactly like a room full of people listing reasons they disliked you. A Karthan minister rose, silver-robed, ancient, ears held at an angle Adrian was learning to read as contempt in a formal setting, and spoke at length. Adrian caught none of it. He turned to Nova, who stood at his shoulder with the patient stillness of a landslide waiting for provocation. "He welcomes the human delegation," Nova said, "and hopes your journey did not damage you further." Adrian blinked. "Further?" His words, not mine. Mine would be shorter. Then came Adrian's turn to respond, because Owen had, with the quiet cowardice of the senior official everywhere, delegated the opening courtesy to our promising junior, which Adrian recognized as diplomatic language for the one we can afford to lose. He rose. He had prepared for this. He had, in fact, drafted a small masterpiece of goodwill, 3 balanced sentences about shared futures, mutual respect, and the long road that had brought 2 peoples to one table. He delivered it with feeling. He gestured, gently, at the shared futures. Nova translated it in 4 syllables. Adrian waited for the rest. There was no rest. 4 syllables hung in the air, brief and flat as a slammed door, and the assembled court received them with the faint collective satisfaction of people whose low expectations had been met precisely on schedule. Above his head, a single thin thread of light flared and guttered out, embarrassingly short. "That," Adrian murmured, sitting slowly back down, was more than 4 syllables when I said it. You used more, Nova agreed. I removed the ones that were decoration. The futures were decoration? You have not built any yet. It is rude to promise furniture you do not own. The session ground on. Adrian spoke. Nova compressed. He offered a graceful acknowledgement of Karthan hospitality. She rendered it, he was fairly sure, as something in the neighborhood of the human notices you fed him. When a lesser minister lobbed an insult across the floor, something involving humans, softness, and a comparison to a food animal Adrian devoutly hoped he was mistranslating in his head, Nova relayed it back to him, complete, unsoftened, and with what he could only describe as relish. She translated their contempt into standard faithfully. She translated his diplomacy into contempt with editorial flourish. Somewhere in the difference between those two directions lay a message, and Adrian, sitting at the bottom of the well with his 4 sad syllables dissolving above him, finally understood what it was. He had not been given a translator. He had been given a verdict. Every other human in the room had a functionary, a smooth, neutral instrument tuned to carry meaning across the gap between species. He'd been handed the one Karthan alive whose entire purpose was to communicate, without a single word, exactly how little the humans were worth. The pairing wasn't clumsy. It was precise. Someone had looked at the treaty, looked at the delegation, and decided the appropriate opening move was to sit the least of the humans beside the most fearsome person on the planet, and let the arithmetic speak for itself. The correct diplomatic response, Adrian knew, was to say nothing and endure it. Complaining to the court would be a confession of weakness so complete they'd probably frame it in light and hang it over the door. Complaining to Owen would achieve a thoughtful nod and absolutely nothing else. So the smart play, the safe play, the play any competent envoy would make, was to bow his head, swallow the insult, and get through the day. Adrian looked up at Nova instead. She was watching the floor, jaw set, ears flat, a woman doing a job she plainly regarded as beneath even her considerable capacity for enduring things. And it occurred to Adrian, with the particular clarity that arrives at the worst possible moments, that in a chamber of several hundred people, he was the only one who had spoken to her since they'd entered. Everyone else spoke around her, or at her, or through the careful architecture of not quite looking. She was the most visible person in the room, and somehow the least addressed, a wall that happened to have opinions. "What's your name mean?" Adrian asked, quietly, between the minister's sentences. Nova's eyes came off the floor. "What?" "Nova. On my world it's a kind of star. The bright, sudden, alarming kind, burns hotter than anything around it. Everyone stops to look. I wondered if it meant something here, or if it's just a good coincidence." For a moment, a genuine, measurable moment, she had no clipped answer ready. Something crossed her face that wasn't contempt and wasn't patience. Something she caught and shuddered before it could finish. "It is not your business," she said, "what my name means." "Fair. Then how about this? The treaty. You've heard every word from both sides today, twice, in 2 languages. You know exactly how badly it's going. What do you think should happen? Not what you're told to say, what you think." The minister was still droning. The court was not watching them. For the length of one long breath, Nova simply looked at him, this small, soft creature at the bottom of the well, who kept, absurdly, asking her questions as though the answers mattered, as though she were a person seated beside him rather than a punishment assigned to him. "You should stop talking," she said at last. "It is safer," but she said it more quietly than everything before it, and she did not look away when she said it, and Adrian understood that the refusal had cost her something small and unaccounted for, some coin neither of them had known she was carrying until she spent it. She turned back to the floor. Above Adrian's head, no light flared, but something faintly had shifted, and both of them were careful not to name it. Nobody warns you before you become a diplomat about the waiting. The briefings are all about the perilous sentences and the catastrophic hand gestures, And nobody mentions that the actual substance of interstellar negotiation is hours upon hours of nothing, spent in rooms that were designed to intimidate and have long since run out of ways to do it. The talks recessed, and recessed again. A subcommittee formed to discuss the shape of a future subcommittee. Somewhere deep in the obsidian, ministers argued about the wording of a clause about the wording of clauses, and the human delegation was left to marinate in a series of antechambers, each grander and emptier than the last. Owen coped by napping upright with his eyes open, a skill Adrian suspected had gotten him the ambassadorship. The others clustered and fretted, and Adrian, who found that idle silence made his skin itch, drifted the corridors with the one companion the universe had seen fit to assign him, a companion who followed at exactly the distance required by protocol, and radiated a wish to be elsewhere. "You don't have to walk with me," Adrian offered on the second such afternoon. "During recess, I'm not going to accidentally start a war between the sofa and the window." "I am assigned to you," Nova said, "until you leave the planet or die. I am hoping for the first. I am prepared for the second." "That's the warmest thing you've said to me." "It was not meant warmly." "I know. That's what makes it warm." She did not answer that, which Adrian was learning was a kind of answer. He'd begun keeping a private ledger of her silences, the flat ones that meant stop, the sharp ones that meant you're an idiot, and the rarer sort, longer and less certain, that he'd tentatively filed under she doesn't have a clipped reply ready and it bothers her. This one went in the third column. He kept talking, because talking was what he had. He asked about the corridors they walked, the reliefs carved into the black glass. Battles fought so long ago, the participants had names in a script even Nova called old-fashioned. He asked why the light filaments in the ceilings dimmed when she passed beneath them, and she said flatly that they didn't, and he pointed out that they very much did, and she looked up and discovered that they did, and said nothing, and they walked on. He asked about the scar that ran from her wrist to the crook of her elbow, pale against the crimson, and she said, "A war." And he asked which one, and she said, "One that is over," and he decided that was 2 whole facts and counted the afternoon a success. He asked about human food once, unwisely, because the delegation had been served a human-catered meal the night before, and Nova had watched him eat it with the expression of a xenobiologist witnessing something regrettable. "It is wet," she said, "and it is soft, and you put it inside your soft, wet body, and I do not understand how your species conquered a single hill, let alone a sky. It's called soup, and it's a comfort food. It is a food that requires comforting. That is a different thing." Adrian laughed, an honest one, startled out of him, ringing off the black glass. And Nova's ears did something small and quick, a flick she suppressed before it finished, and Adrian pretended not to see it because he was beginning to understand that seeing things was how you lost them. It was in the 4th corridor of the 3rd afternoon that the pretending stopped being enough. A courtier came the other way, one of the silver-robed junior sort, young enough to still enjoy cruelty for its own sake. He recognized the human. More to the point, he recognized the human's escort, and something in him decided the moment was too good to waste. He stopped in the center of the corridor, blocking it with the casual arrogance of someone who has never once been made to move. And he spoke, not to Adrian, but past him, at Nova, low and fast and venomous, in Karthan. Adrian understood none of the words. He understood every one of them anyway. There is a music to being demeaned that translates across any species, the smile that isn't one, the eyes flicking down and away, the pleasure of saying something to a person that is really meant to be overheard. Nova stood very still. Her ears had gone flat and stayed flat. The courtier finished, satisfied, and turned his attention to Adrian for the finale, took a step, hand rising, into whatever petty theater he had planned, some shove or seizure meant to make the human flinch for an audience of one sneering Karthan. He did not complete the step. Nova moved between them, and Adrian didn't see the moment she chose to. There was no decision he could point to, no visible calculation, just the sudden fact of her, crimson and scarred, filling the space where harm had been about to happen. She didn't touch the courtier. She didn't have to. She simply was there, and the whole tenor of the corridor changed, the way a room changes when the temperature drops 10 degrees between one breath and the next. She said one word, just one. The courtier's face performed a rapid and comprehensive recalculation, and then he was gone, robes hissing on the glass, having discovered urgent business in another wing of the palace. The corridor was very quiet. "Thank you," Adrian said. "It is my assignment," Nova said, already stepping back, already rebuilding the distance protocol required. "To keep you alive, nothing more." "Right. The keeping me alive clause. Very thorough. You would have been bruised. It would have delayed the talks. I acted for the talks. Absolutely. For the talks." Adrian nodded, gravely, agreeably, as if he believed every word, and Nova looked at him with narrowed eyes because she could tell he didn't, and he looked back with the bland innocence of a man who has decided to let both of them keep their dignity. Because it would have been easy and true, to say, "You didn't move like someone protecting a clause. You moved like someone protecting a person." But he'd learned by now that some things, named too soon, simply stopped. So he swallowed it, and she rebuilt her wall, and they walked on down the black glass corridor pretending, with great and mutual effort, that nothing at all had just happened between them. Adrian learned who Nova was, the way you learn the shape of a mountain. Not all at once, but by circling it long enough that the silhouette assembles itself against the sky. It came in fragments, most of them not from her. A servant who brought the evening meal went pale and silent when Nova entered, and left faster than dignity allowed. A pair of ministers in a corridor lowered their voices as she passed and raised them again after, and the word they used, Adrian's translator band rendered, meant something close to the emptier, as in, the one who empties a battlefield, the one whose arrival on a field was itself a form of surrender for everyone standing on the wrong side of her. He got the rest, eventually, from Nova, because he did the reckless thing of simply asking and then waiting, which turned out to be a tool very few people had ever used on her. There had been wars, the ordinary kind, the kind Karth apparently kept in stock the way other worlds kept weather. Nova had been good at them. Not good the way a soldier is good, but good the way a natural disaster is good at being a disaster. Complete, decisive, impossible to reason with once committed. She'd won campaigns that generals had written off. She'd walked out of engagements no one was supposed to walk out of, and each time she did, the legend around her thickened by a layer, until the legend was heavier than the woman and everyone had stopped being able to tell them apart. The court needed her. A weapon like that you keep. But needing a thing and being able to look at it are different capacities, and Karth had solved the discomfort in the usual way of frightened institutions. It kept her close and useful and utterly, deliberately alone. A translator's post was the polite version of a leash. "So they gave the leash to me," Adrian said. They were in one of the empty antechambers, late, the light filaments overhead dimmed to a slow amber drift. The most feared person on the planet, handed to the least important human in the building. That's the joke, isn't it? Nobody expected me to survive it, and nobody would have minded much if I didn't. "You understand it now," Nova said. Not unkindly. "It took you longer than I expected. That is either stupidity or something else. I have not decided. Vote for something else. It's better for my self-esteem." The near disaster came the following morning, and it came, as disasters at treaty tables always do, from a clause nobody had read carefully. A sub-article on resource corridors, mineral rights through a contested stretch of dead space, had been drafted by the humans in language that was scrupulously fair, and, it turned out, mortally insulting, because the standard word for shared mapped onto a Karthan concept reserved exclusively for things one takes from a defeated enemy. The minister reading it aloud stopped. The chamber went the specific brittle quiet of a room realizing it has been called something unforgivable in writing, in light, in front of everyone. Owen, sensing catastrophe, did the thing Owen did in a crisis, which was to look meaningfully at Adrian and gesture him toward the fire. Adrian stood into the silence with absolutely no idea what he'd done or how to undo it. He had one asset. He turned to it. Nova, I've insulted them, and I don't know how. Tell me what I actually said. And Nova, who could have let him drown, whose entire assignment had been designed on the assumption that she would enjoy watching him drown, told him. Fast, low, precise. The word, the wound, the shape of the offense. And then, because he asked, because he looked at her like her answer was the most valuable thing in the room, she told him how to fix it, which older word to reach for, the one that meant held in common by choice, the one that turned a boast of conquest into an offer of partnership. Adrian spoke it. Badly. His accent mangled it into something that made two ministers wince. But the meaning landed, and the chamber's brittle quiet cracked and softened, and above his head a thread of light flared and, for the first time, did not immediately gutter out. It held. It lengthened. Someone in the upper tiers made a low sound that Nova, when he glanced at her, translated with the ghost of something at the corner of her mouth. Approval. Do not get used to it. They worked after that, like people who had forgotten to keep disliking each other. He'd draft, she'd catch the buried insults before they detonated. She'd render the Karthan positions faithfully now, all of them, the traps and the openings both, and he'd find the human answer that fit the Karthan shape. It was, embarrassingly, a good partnership. It was the kind of thing that, if the two governments had been trying to build trust, they'd have engineered on purpose. Which was, Adrian slowly realized over the amber-lit evening that followed, precisely the problem. Because someone had engineered this pairing, and that someone had been betting on the opposite outcome entirely. Nova, he said, turning a cup of Karthan tea he had no intention of drinking. Whoever assigned you to me. They wanted me to fail. They wanted you to let me fail, or help me, quietly, in the ways nobody would ever catch. A fierce translator, a fragile human, a treaty that collapses, and everyone gets to say the humans were never worth the table. He set the cup down. That was the plan on day one. The insult wasn't the whole of it. The insult was step one. Nova was quiet a long moment. The amber light drifted across her scars, and for once her ears weren't flat. They were forward, alert, the posture of someone hearing a thing she'd half known and never said aloud. There is a faction, she said slowly, that does not want peace, that profits from the other thing. They have wanted this table to break since before your shuttle landed. She looked at him, and the look had changed, no longer measuring how little he was worth, but weighing for the first time how much he might be. I was chosen because I am the thing your people fear most. They did not expect the human to ask my name. No, Adrian agreed. I don't imagine they planned for that. They did not plan, Nova said very quietly. For you at all. The trap, when it sprang, was elegant, which Adrian would have admired if it hadn't been closing around his throat. It began with a sound in the night, an alarm threading through the guest wing in a key that made human teeth ache, and Karthan guards flooding the corridors, and the human delegation herded blinking into the great council chamber before any of them had properly found their shoes. Owen arrived with his robe on inside out and his ambassadorial dignity nowhere in evidence. And there, waiting at the bottom of the well, laid out in cold, accusing light, was the reason, an artifact. A Karthan relic of some ceremonial weight, a thing the court venerated, sitting in a case that had been forced open, and beside it, damning and precise, a fragment of human-issue fabric snagged on the broken housing, and a record in the drifting overhead lattice showing a figure of roughly human height slipping from the vault an hour before dawn. The silver-robed minister who had opened the first day's grievances rose, and this time his ears carried no formal contempt. They carried triumph, held very still so as not to show it. He spoke, and Nova translated at Adrian's shoulder in a low, flat voice that Adrian could hear was working hard to stay flat. The humans have stolen from the heart of the court, she said. Theft during a treaty is an act of war. They demand the thief be surrendered. A pause. They name you. The fabric is from the junior envoy's quarters. The record shows a human of your height. They have already decided. This is not an inquiry. It is a sentence looking for a room to be read in. Adrian's mouth had gone dry. He understood, with the terrible clarity of a man watching a plan he'd only theorized about arrive fully assembled, that this was the faction's real move. Not a subtle sabotage, not a quietly failed clause, but a knife. Frame the fragile human, force the surrender, collapse the talks into blood and grievance and the righteous fury of a violated court, and hand the warmongers their invasion wrapped in the ribbon of the law. The insult on the first day, the leash of a translator, the whole engineered humiliation. It had all been the long approach to this single stroke. And the final beauty of it, the part that made Adrian want to laugh even as his stomach dropped, was that it required nothing of Nova now but silence. She was the court's creature, assigned, leashed, the emptier who belonged to Karth. All she had to do was step back. Let the human be taken. Save herself, as everyone in the chamber plainly expected her to, because no one gives their life for a punishment they were saddled with. The minister said something else, and Nova didn't translate it, and Adrian knew from the shape of the pause what it was. The offer, the out. Stand aside, weapon, and this need not touch you. The chamber waited. Hundreds of ears turned toward the crimson woman at the bottom of the well, watching the leash do its work. Adrian spoke first, because he'd be damned if she was going to have to choose in front of all of them without him at least going down swinging on her behalf. "I didn't take it," he said to the whole descending court, loud enough that the lattice caught his words and hung them glowing overhead. "You know I didn't. The fabric's a plant, the height's a guess, and the timing is far too convenient for a coincidence in a room this fond of schemes. But I'm not going to stand here and argue my own innocence, because that's not actually what this is about." He turned, deliberately away from the ministers and toward Nova, toward the one person in the chamber everyone was refusing to look at. "This is about her, about the fact that you handed me the fiercest person on this planet expecting her to help you break me, and she didn't. So now you'll break me a different way, and you expect her to let you, because that's all any of you have ever asked of her, to be a weapon and then to be quiet." His voice dropped, but the lattice caught it anyway. "I won't let them use you to bury me, Nova. Whatever happens next, you didn't do this. You're not part of this. Say the word and step back, and I'll never hold it against you. You were assigned to me. You don't owe me the rest of your life." For a moment, the whole obsidian chamber was silent enough to hear the light hum. And Nova, who had spent her entire existence being chosen as a weapon, chosen as a punishment, chosen as a leash, never once permitted to choose in return, looked at the small, soft human who was, incredibly, trying to give her a way out at the cost of his own neck. And she did the one thing no one in that chamber had ever seen her do. She stepped forward, not back. She placed herself between Adrian and the whole descending weight of the court, ears forward, scars bare in the accusing light, and she spoke, not in the clipped, reluctant syllables of a translator, but in full, ringing Karthan, her own voice, her own words, addressed to the minister and the faction behind him and every silent tier above. "I decline," Nova said, and translated it herself, for Adrian, quietly, even now. Then louder, for the room. "The human did not do this. I was awake in the hour named. I know where he was, and it was not the vault. And I know a planted thing when I see one. I have planted enough of them for men like you. In wars you were too soft to fight yourselves." Her voice went cold and clear as the black glass. "You built this to make me a weapon one last time, to make my silence the blade. I have been many things you pointed me at. I will not be that." She looked once at Adrian. "This one asked my name. None of you ever did. I have chosen my side. It is not yours." The lattice overhead blazed with her words, thread after thread flaring and holding, refusing to die. And in the stunned, roaring, upended silence that followed, Adrian understood that the trap had just closed on the wrong prey entirely. A planted trap has one weakness, which is that someone has to plant it, and planting is a thing that happens in a place, at a time, by a pair of hands. Nova knew this the way she knew everything about the machinery of grievance, from the inside. And Adrian, it turned out, had spent 3 days of tedious antechambers learning exactly how the court's lattice of light recorded and stored its proceedings, because a nervous man will read anything to avoid sitting still, and the manuals in the guest wing had been extremely dull and extremely thorough. So while the chamber still rang with Nova's refusal, the two of them did the thing they'd become alarmingly good at. They worked together, fast, in front of everyone. "The record they showed," Adrian said to the whole descending court. "The figure leaving the vault. It's stored in the lattice. All of it is. Every thread of every hour, written in light and kept." He looked up at the minister, who had begun, very slightly, to lose the stillness in his ears. "So, play the hour before the one you chose, not the human of my height leaving, the moment the case was opened. Play it, in front of all of us, or explain to the court why the 1 hour you won't show is the only hour that matters." The minister said the record was incomplete. The minister said the earlier threads had decayed, as old light does. And Nova, standing bare-scarred at the bottom of the well, said flatly, in ringing Karthan, that light in the court lattice did not decay for a full cycle, and every person above the rank of servant knew it, and would the minister care to be the one who claimed otherwise on the record, in the light, forever? The minister did not care to, but the court did. An elder of the neutral tiers, one of the old ones who had watched the whole treaty with the weary patience of someone who had seen factions rise and rot before, called for the hour to be shown, and the lattice, obedient and merciless, unspooled it, the vault, the dark, and a figure crossing to the case, not a human, Karthan tall, silver-robed, and when it turned briefly into the light of its own lamp to force the housing, the face that surfaced in the drifting threads belonged to a junior courtier the whole chamber recognized, the same young cruel one who had cornered Adrian in the corridor days before, who had been sent, it was now devastatingly clear, to snag a fragment of human fabric on his sneering way past. The threads held. They did not gutter. They hung over the chamber in cold, accusing light, and there is no arguing with a thing everyone can see glowing above their heads. The faction came apart the way such things do once the first seam gives, quickly, and with a great deal of everyone suddenly remembering they'd had reservations all along. The silver minister was escorted out beneath his own luminous confession. The warmongers who'd bankrolled the scheme discovered that a court which has just been publicly made a fool of is a court hungry for someone to blame, and blame, unlike light, is a resource Karth never ran short of. By the time the two suns rose, the peace faction, quiet all along, waiting for the war party to overreach, held the floor, and the overreach had been so complete and so publicly lit that no one could pretend it hadn't happened. The treaty was signed 3 days later. Adrian drafted the resource clause himself, the contested one, and reached for the old word Nova had taught him, held in common by choice, and got the accent right this time, mostly, and the lattice flared long and steady above the table as both delegations set their marks to it. Owen took enormous credit in his report home, and Adrian let him, because Adrian had discovered somewhere in the last 2 weeks that he no longer needed the credit to know the shape of what he'd done. He had come to Karth as a man who got through rooms by saying as little as possible and hoping to be overlooked, the junior they could afford to lose, and who had rather agreed with the assessment. He was not that man on the flight home. He'd been handed the worst assignment in the delegation, the calculated insult, the fiercest woman in the galaxy pointed at him like a loaded question, and he'd answered the question by refusing to see a weapon where there was a person. That refusal had turned out to be the strongest thing in the entire chamber. He'd learned that the bravest thing he owned was not courage, but curiosity, the plain, stubborn insistence on asking a name. And the great insult of the first day had inverted itself completely. The other humans had been given functionaries, smooth and forgettable, who carried words across the gap and nothing else. Adrian had been given the one Karthan on the planet honest enough to refuse an order, fierce enough to make the refusal stick, and, as it happened, the only translator in the building who had ever told him the truth about what was being said in the room. The delegation that had pitied him now, quietly, envied him. He'd gotten the best of the lot. He'd just had to survive her first. There was the matter still of what came next. The loose thread neither of them had named. Nova had chosen her side in open court, and a weapon that chooses is no longer a weapon anyone can hold a leash on. The court, in its gratitude and its embarrassment, had offered her a great many things. She had declined all of them. "So what will you do?" Adrian asked her on the landing platform, under the violet clouds, with the shuttle waiting and Owen already aboard and pretending not to watch. "Now that you're nobody's assignment?" Nova considered this. Her ears were forward. She had, over 2 weeks, gradually stopped holding them flat around him, and Adrian had gradually stopped pretending not to notice, and somewhere in there, they'd both quietly given up the great mutual effort of naming nothing. "There is a human delegation," she said, "that draws war down on itself every time it opens its soft, wet mouth. It insults ministers by accident. It promises furniture it does not own. It would not survive a single season of real diplomacy without someone to remove the decoration from its words." A pause. The corner of her mouth did the thing it had learned to do. "It will need a translator. A real one. Not assigned, chosen." Adrian looked at the fiercest woman in the galaxy, who had been given to him as a slight and had turned out to be the truest thing on the planet, and who was now, of her own free and terrifying will, asking to come with him. "The pay's bad," he warned her. "The food's wet, and I should tell you, the last translator they gave me was impossible. Fierce, rude, editorialized everything. Ruined me for the ordinary kind." "Good," said Nova, and picked up her bag, and walked with him up the ramp. No leash, no order, no one's weapon, choosing at last the one direction no one had ever pointed her in. And the shuttle rose through the violet clouds of Karth toward whatever the two of them, together, would decide to make of the rest of it. They gave everyone else a translator, and they gave him a warning. The fiercest woman in the galaxy, meant as an insult he was supposed to survive, not befriend. But Adrian did the one thing no one had ever thought to do with her. He didn't see a weapon. He saw a person, and he asked her name. And maybe that's the quiet truth the whole story turns on. That the people we're taught to fear are so often just the people no one ever bothered to speak to. That the fiercest thing in any room is rarely the sharpest weapon. It's the plain, stubborn courage to be curious, where everyone else has already decided to be afraid. So here's what lingers, long after the shuttle rises through the violet clouds. Who in your own life was handed to you as a warning? Who did you write off before you ever learned their name? And how many people out there are waiting, flat-eared and armored, guarding a whole self behind the reputation the world assigned them? Waiting for one person, just one, who isn't afraid of what they are. Nova spent a lifetime being chosen for, pointed, aimed, leashed, and kept quiet. And it took a soft, frightened, endlessly talking human to remind her that the bravest act any of us ever commits isn't winning a battle. It's choosing, freely, where we belong, and who we walk up the ramp beside. Ask the name. You never know who's been waiting their whole life for someone too. The end. Nova and Adrian's story ends here, friends. I have a request in return for our efforts. Please like the story, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next story. See you very soon in a brand new episode. Goodbye.